My beloved child, something changed in the exact moment they saw your soulmate standing beside you, and it was not the dramatic reaction anyone expected. It was quieter than that. A pause. A look held half a second too long. A realization settling into a place where confidence had been only moments before. Because the third party had prepared themselves for many possibilities, but they had not prepared for what they actually witnessed between you. There was no performance. No desperate attempt to prove anything. No grand declaration. Just a strange ease between two people who seemed to understand something without having to explain it. And somehow, that was what unsettled their plan most. Plan number one depended on distance. It depended on your soulmate continuing to wonder about you from far away, filling unanswered spaces with doubt, misunderstanding, and assumptions. The third party believed that if enough uncertainty remained between you, eventually the connection would weaken on its own. But then came the moment they never accounted for. Your soulmate saw you clearly again. Not through somebody else's opinion. Not through an old misunderstanding. Not through a story repeated so many times that it began to sound true. They saw you with their own eyes, heard the calmness in your voice, noticed the way you carried yourself, and suddenly the version of you they had been encouraged to believe no longer matched the person standing in front of them. Don't skip this part, because the first plan did not fail because you fought against it. It failed because you stopped needing to fight at all. There is a difference, and your soulmate noticed it. They noticed that you were not trying to compete for their attention. You were not trying to pull them toward you. You were simply present, steady, and somehow more yourself than before. That created a question in their mind that would not disappear. If everything I was told about this person was true, why does being near them feel so different from what I expected? That question became the first crack in plan number one. And once a sincere question enters the heart, borrowed opinions begin losing their power. What happened next was even more revealing. Your soulmate started remembering small things. Not the dramatic memories people usually expect, but tiny details that had been buried beneath all the noise. The way you once listened when they were struggling to explain themselves. The moment you chose kindness when being cold would have been easier. A conversation they thought they had forgotten. A promise you never announced but quietly kept. These memories returned one by one, and suddenly your presence was not only reminding them of the past. It was forcing them to reconsider what that past actually meant. Somewhere nearby, the third party could sense this shift without hearing a single word. They could see it in your soulmate's expression. Their shoulders were less guarded. Their attention kept returning to you naturally. There was a softness that could not be instructed, negotiated, or controlled. And this is where the title of this story begins to mean something deeper, because lost control does not have to mean chaos. Sometimes losing control simply means discovering that the outcome you carefully planned is no longer yours to manage. Something important is waiting for you here. The third party had believed their influence was stronger than your history with your soulmate. But influence built on confusion is fragile when clarity arrives. Your soulmate was beginning to separate what they personally knew about you from what they had merely heard about you. And once they made that distinction, their entire emotional map began changing. Imagine that quiet moment. Your soulmate looking at you, perhaps pretending everything was ordinary, while inside them an old question was turning into a completely new one. They were no longer asking, "Should I stay away?" They were beginning to ask, "Why was I convinced that I needed to?" That single change mattered more than any confession could have. Because now they were searching backward through conversations, warnings, strange timing, unexplained tension, and subtle suggestions they had once accepted without examination. And somewhere within those memories, one detail suddenly looked different. The third party had always seemed most concerned whenever you and your soulmate were about to communicate directly. Think about that. Whenever distance increased, everything stayed calm. Whenever honesty seemed close, another complication appeared. Whenever your soulmate began questioning the story, somebody quickly supplied another reason not to look deeper. Until now, those moments had seemed unrelated. Standing near you changed that. For the first time, your soulmate saw the pattern instead of only the individual events. Yet they said nothing. That silence was important. Because instead of reacting immediately, your soulmate became observant. And the third party noticed. Their usual explanations were no longer being accepted instantly. Their little suggestions were met with pauses. Their assumptions were met with unexpected questions. Nothing aggressive. Nothing harsh. Just simple questions that were surprisingly difficult to answer. How do you know that? Did they actually say that? Were you there when it happened? One question led to another, and suddenly plan number one was not simply weakening. It had become impossible to continue in the same way. Stay till the end, because this is where plan number two begins, and it was created for one reason only. The third party realized that separating you physically had not erased the emotional recognition between you. So instead of trying to create more distance, plan number two would attempt something much more subtle. They would try to change what your soulmate believed your intentions were. At first, the idea seemed clever. If your soulmate could no longer be convinced that you were the wrong person, perhaps they could be convinced that you wanted the wrong thing. Maybe your calmness could be interpreted as indifference. Maybe your patience could be called hesitation. Maybe your boundaries could be described as rejection. Maybe the very qualities your soulmate had begun appreciating could be turned into reasons to doubt you again. But there was a problem the third party did not notice soon enough. Your soulmate had already started watching you more carefully than before. Not obsessively. Not suspiciously. Simply attentively. And when people begin observing reality for themselves, second-hand interpretations become much harder to maintain. Your soulmate noticed how your actions lined up over time. They noticed that you did not behave like someone playing a game. You behaved like someone who had learned not to chase what needed to choose them freely. That realization touched something deep inside them because they had been expecting you to prove yourself. Instead, your peace became the proof. Suddenly, an old conversation came back to them. Perhaps months earlier, perhaps longer, you had said something simple that seemed insignificant at the time. Something about wanting honesty over appearances. Something about not forcing people to stay. Something about believing that genuine connection should not require manipulation. Back then your soulmate barely registered it. Now those words returned with completely different meaning. And that was when plan number two encountered its first unexpected obstacle before it had even properly begun. Your soulmate already knew your emotional language. They might have forgotten pieces of it, but they recognized it when they saw it again. Here is the rare realization that changed the entire atmosphere. The third party had spent so much energy trying to define you that they accidentally encouraged your soulmate to study you more closely. And the closer your soulmate looked, the less believable those definitions became. What if the very attempt to make someone doubt you becomes the reason they finally understand you? That question was now quietly forming inside your soulmate. The third party could feel their influence shrinking, but they misunderstood why. They thought your soulmate was simply becoming emotional because you were nearby. They did not realize something far more meaningful was happening. Your soulmate was comparing words against experience, and experience was winning. Then came a tiny moment nobody planned. Your soulmate smiled at something you said. Nothing extraordinary. Perhaps it was an old joke only the two of you understood. Perhaps you remembered a detail they did not expect you to remember. Perhaps there was simply a moment when both of you stopped being careful and became natural again. But the third party saw that smile, and something about it revealed what they had been afraid to admit: the connection had not been surviving because someone was forcing it to survive. It had survived because beneath the confusion, there was still genuine recognition. And recognition is difficult to manufacture. You either feel that sense of familiarity with someone or you do not. Your soulmate felt it. They tried to hide how much the moment affected them, but later, when they were alone, they replayed it. Not because the smile itself mattered so much, but because of how effortless it had felt. They had spent so long preparing themselves to feel uncomfortable around you that feeling peaceful instead created a powerful contradiction. This was supposed to be complicated. Why did one honest moment make everything suddenly seem simple? And now listen closely, because this is where the second plan becomes more surprising than the first. The third party did not decide to confront you. They did not decide to confront your soulmate either. They chose something far quieter. They began preparing a story about something you supposedly wanted from your soulmate, hoping that if the timing was right, it would make your soulmate question the sincerity of everything they had just experienced. But before that story could be delivered, your soulmate did something nobody expected. They asked about you first. Not casually. Not through another person. They asked a direct question that suggested they had already been thinking far more deeply than anyone realized. What did they actually say about me? The room changed. Because that question required facts, not interpretations. And facts were exactly what plan number 2 was not designed to survive. A vague story can remain convincing until somebody asks for the exact words. A misunderstanding can survive until somebody checks what truly happened. Your soulmate had reached that point. They were no longer satisfied with summaries. They wanted the original conversation, the actual context, the missing details. For the first time, the third party realized that your soulmate might eventually speak to you directly about everything. And if that happened, both plans could unravel at once. Yet here is what makes this part of the story deeply personal for you. You may have spent so much time wondering what you should say when the truth finally starts coming forward. You may imagine needing the perfect explanation, the perfect timing, the perfect sentence that makes every misunderstanding disappear. But your greatest strength may be much simpler. You do not need to perform clarity. You only need to remain consistent with who you truly are. Let your soulmate ask. Let them notice. Let them connect their own dots. Sometimes the most convincing truth is discovered, not delivered. And your soulmate was beginning to discover something that made them unexpectedly emotional, not because they suddenly understood everything, but because they realized how much of their understanding had never actually come from you. For a moment, they sat with that. Quietly. And something softened. Not toward the third party. Not even entirely toward you. Toward themselves. They began recognizing how easy it can be to accept another person's interpretation when you are confused, hurt, or uncertain. That recognition did not fill them with anger. It made them more careful. More thoughtful. More determined to hear things directly before making another decision about you. And somewhere inside that decision, the entire direction of the story shifted. Because plan number 2 depended on your soulmate believing another interpretation without checking it. Now checking things was exactly what they intended to do. But the third party still had one advantage your soulmate had not discovered yet. Plan number 2 was not built around a new lie or a dramatic accusation. It was built around something real, one genuine moment from your past that could be presented without its missing context. That is why it seemed so convincing. That is why, when your soulmate finally heard about it, even they went silent for a moment. The third party thought that silence meant the plan was finally working. They did not realize your soulmate had already decided to do something different this time. Instead of believing the story immediately, they were going to bring that forgotten moment directly to you. And what you would reveal about what actually happened that day would not only change how your soulmate understood plan number 2. It would expose the first clue that there had always been a third plan waiting behind both of them. The detail your soulmate was about to bring to you seemed small enough to dismiss, yet it carried exactly the kind of missing context that could change the meaning of everything they had been told. For days, the third party had been waiting for this moment, convinced that one carefully chosen piece of the past would finally restore the doubt that plan number 1 had failed to create. They did not need to invent anything dramatic. That was what made plan number 2 so convincing. They only needed to take something real, remove the reason behind it, and allow your soulmate to reach the wrong conclusion on their own. But there was one thing they underestimated again: your soulmate was no longer listening the same way. Something had shifted after seeing you. The ease between you had stayed in their mind longer than they expected. The smile they tried to forget kept returning. The questions they had begun asking were becoming harder to silence. So when the third party finally mentioned that forgotten moment, your soulmate did not immediately react. They listened. They waited. And then they asked the one question the third party had hoped would never come. What happened right before that? The answer did not arrive quickly. There was a pause that felt almost too noticeable. A change in tone. A vague response that explained everything except the thing your soulmate had actually asked. And strangely, that hesitation mattered more than the story itself. Don't skip what happened next, because this was the first time your soulmate realized the problem might not be what they had been told. The problem might be what had been left out. They began thinking back to the old situation differently. The version they had just heard made it sound as though you had suddenly stepped away, suddenly gone quiet, suddenly chosen distance at a moment when your soulmate needed clarity. Without context, it looked confusing. Maybe even disappointing. But your soulmate remembered something else now, a detail they had almost forgotten. Around that same time, they had been receiving conflicting messages. Someone had suggested you wanted space. Someone else had implied you had already moved forward. And because neither of you spoke directly enough, both sides had quietly adjusted their behavior around information that had never been properly verified. Suddenly, the past looked less like a story of two people deliberately walking away and more like two people responding to shadows neither of them had created. Your soulmate felt something tighten inside, not fear, not anger, but recognition. They had seen this pattern before. Every time communication between you almost became simple, something complicated appeared between the two of you. A comment. A delay. An interpretation. An assumption delivered with just enough confidence to seem reliable. Until now, those moments had remained scattered. Plan number 2 accidentally connected them. And once those pieces began joining together, your soulmate could no longer pretend they were unrelated. Stay till the end, because what they decided to do next completely changed the balance. Instead of confronting the third party, your soulmate protected the question. They did not reveal how much they were reconsidering. They did not announce that something felt incomplete. They simply said, "I understand," and allowed the conversation to end. The third party mistook calmness for agreement. They believed plan number 2 had finally landed exactly where they wanted. But your soulmate was already preparing to hear your side directly. And when that moment came, it did not begin with accusation. It began with uncertainty. Perhaps your soulmate approached you carefully. Perhaps the conversation happened through a message after they spent far too long deciding whether to send it. Perhaps it was a quiet moment when neither of you expected anything serious to be discussed. Whatever the setting, the energy was different this time. Your soulmate was not looking for a reason to prove you wrong. They were looking for the missing part of the story. "Do you remember that day?" they asked. Of course you did. But the memory you carried was not the memory they had just been given. You remembered waiting for something that never arrived. You remembered believing your soulmate had changed their mind. You remembered pulling back not because you stopped caring, but because you thought continuing forward would disrespect a boundary that you believed they had chosen. There had been no secret motive. No hidden game. No desire to make them wonder. You had simply acted according to what you believed was true at the time. And when your soulmate heard this, they became very still. Not because your explanation was dramatic. The opposite. It was so simple that everything suddenly became harder to ignore. "Who told you I wanted that?" they asked. And there it was, the question underneath every question. You hesitated, perhaps because the answer seemed almost irrelevant after so much time. But when you finally explained where the impression had come from, your soulmate recognized the connection immediately. The information had traveled through the same circle that had repeatedly encouraged them to remain distant from you. Maybe not always through the same person. Maybe not always deliberately. But the pattern was there. Your soulmate did not need anyone to explain what it meant. They were beginning to see it themselves. Something important is waiting for you in this realization. Sometimes a connection is not damaged by one enormous event. Sometimes it becomes tangled through tiny pieces of incomplete information passed from one person to another until nobody remembers where the original truth ended and interpretation began. Your soulmate had spent so long searching for a dramatic reason behind the distance that they almost missed the ordinary explanation. The two of you had been responding to each other's supposed choices without actually hearing those choices from each other. And now, for the first time, both of you were standing in the same version of reality. The emotional shift was subtle but unmistakable. Your soulmate did not suddenly promise anything. You did not suddenly erase everything that had happened. Instead, something healthier appeared, honesty without performance. Your soulmate admitted that they had misunderstood certain things. You admitted that you had made assumptions too. There was no need to decide the entire future in that moment. It was enough to finally name what had gone wrong. And strangely, that simple honesty created more closeness than all the dramatic explanations either of you had imagined needing. Somewhere else, the third party remained confident that plan number 2 had succeeded. They expected your soulmate to become distant again. They expected fewer questions about you. They expected the natural warmth they had witnessed earlier to disappear. But the next time they saw your soulmate, the opposite had happened. Your soulmate seemed calmer, less reactive, more certain about what they would and would not accept without checking. That calmness confused the third party because it could not be easily challenged. If your soulmate had become angry, they could have redirected the anger. If your soulmate had become emotional, they could have offered another interpretation. But calm curiosity was much harder to influence. Your soulmate had developed a new rule for themselves: anything important about you would be discussed with you. Nothing else would be treated as final. That rule quietly destroyed the foundation of plan number 2. And this was the moment the third party truly lost control. Not of your soulmate, because nobody should control another person, but of the narrative they had grown accustomed to shaping. The story no longer belonged to whoever spoke first. It belonged to what could actually be verified. Every new claim now faced the possibility of one simple response: I'll ask them. Imagine how much power those 3 words removed from misunderstanding. Suddenly there was no room for conveniently missing context. No room for assumptions presented as facts. No room for different versions of the same conversation circulating without comparison. Your soulmate had unknowingly closed the door through which most of the confusion had entered. Yet the third party had not given up. They had always known there might be a moment when indirect influence stopped working, which was why plan number 3 existed. But before that third plan could begin, something unexpected happened between you and your soulmate that neither of you had planned. A conversation that was supposed to last only a few minutes continued longer. One question became another. The past slowly opened, not painfully, but carefully. Your soulmate asked why you never reached out during a particular period. You explained that you believed they did not want you to. You asked why they suddenly became cold after a certain conversation. They explained they had been told your intentions had changed. Again and again, the same strange pattern appeared. Each of you had been protecting yourselves from a rejection the other person had never actually expressed. And at some point, you both stopped speaking because the truth was becoming almost unbelievable in its simplicity. How many moments had been lost because neither of you knew what the other truly thought? Your soulmate looked at you differently then. There was sadness for the time that had passed, yes, but something gentler was stronger than sadness: relief. Because the distance no longer meant what they had once feared it meant. It had not necessarily been proof that the connection lacked depth. It had often been proof that communication had lacked clarity. Those are very different things. Your soulmate realized they had been interpreting your silence as absence of feeling when your silence had sometimes been an act of respect. You realized their distance had not always been indifference, sometimes it had been uncertainty. The story both of you had carried privately began rewriting itself in real time. Not into a perfect romance. Not into a fantasy where every misunderstanding disappeared. Into something more believable, 2 people discovering that honesty might still give them a chance to understand each other correctly. Then your soulmate said something you were not expecting. I wish I had asked you sooner. It was not a confession of forever. It was not a promise about tomorrow. But it was one of the most meaningful sentences they could have offered because it acknowledged the exact thing that had kept the connection trapped for so long. You answered simply. Maybe you told them you wished the same. Maybe you smiled. Maybe neither of you needed another sentence. For a moment, there was no third party, no old plan, no competing version of the past. There were only two people finally having the conversation they should have been allowed to have much earlier. And that moment became dangerous to plan number 3 because plan number 3 depended on one specific assumption, that even if your soulmate discovered the old misunderstandings, they would still be too uncertain to trust their own experience with you. The third party believed history had created enough hesitation that one final strategy could reopen every doubt. What they did not know was that your soulmate had just learned something more important than any single fact about the past. They had learned what direct communication with you felt like. Calm. Clear. Human. Imperfect, perhaps, but real. Once someone experiences that, returning entirely to second-hand assumptions becomes difficult. Still, plan number 3 had already begun quietly in the background. Unlike the first two plans, it was not centered on keeping you apart or changing how your soulmate interpreted you. It focused on timing. The third party intended to create the impression that your soulmate had waited too long, that whatever connection existed between you had already moved beyond the point where anything meaningful could happen. It was a clever emotional angle because it did not need to make your soulmate distrust you. It only needed to make them distrust the possibility of the future. And for a brief moment, it almost worked. The next day, your soulmate heard something that made them stop completely. Someone casually suggested that you might be ready to close this chapter, that you were perhaps entering a different season of your life, that maybe the window between you had already passed. Nobody presented it as a warning. That would have been too obvious. It was delivered almost gently, as though the person speaking was trying to protect your soulmate from disappointment. Maybe it's better not to reopen everything, they said. Your soulmate remained quiet. This time the words reached a vulnerable place because there was a part of them that already feared exactly that. What if clarity had arrived too late? What if understanding the past did not automatically create a future? What if you had learned to live without them so completely that their return would only disturb your peace? For the first time since your honest conversation, uncertainty returned. But notice how different this uncertainty was. Earlier, your soulmate questioned your character. Now they were questioning timing. That difference mattered because it showed how much had already changed. They no longer believed you had secretly wanted to hurt them. They no longer automatically trusted every interpretation they heard. Their concern was something deeply human, perhaps the opportunity had simply passed. They carried that question quietly until the next time they saw you. And the third party, observing from a distance, believed plan number 3 had finally found the opening the first two plans could not. Your soulmate was quieter around you. More careful. The third party saw hesitation and assumed it meant withdrawal. But what they could not hear was the conversation happening inside your soulmate's mind. They were deciding whether to ask you the most vulnerable question yet. Not, what happened? Not, who said what? Not, why did you leave? This question was about now. And asking it would require them to risk receiving an answer they could not control. You noticed something had changed. Perhaps your soulmate looked away more often. Perhaps they started a sentence and abandoned it. Perhaps there was an unusual softness in their voice that made you realize they were carrying something important. You did not force them to explain. And strangely, your patience became the thing that gave them enough courage to continue. "Can I ask you something without making it bigger than it is?" they finally said. You agreed. They paused, and then the question arrived. "Do you think there's still anything here worth understanding?" For a second, everything slowed. Because you knew they were not asking whether the past mattered. They were asking whether the future was already closed. And your response would determine whether plan number 3 had any chance of surviving. You did not rush toward a dramatic answer. You did not promise a perfect outcome. You simply told the truth. Yes, there were things worth understanding. Yes, what happened between you deserved honesty. And no, understanding did not have to mean forcing the future into a shape neither of you was ready to choose. The two of you could simply take one honest step at a time. Your soulmate exhaled as though they had been holding that breath much longer than you realized. That was the exact moment plan number 3 began failing before the third party even knew your soulmate had asked the question. Because plan number 3 had been built on urgency. The idea that your soulmate needed to decide everything immediately or accept that everything was already over. Your answer removed urgency from the equation. There was no race. No dramatic deadline. No need to prove anything overnight. Suddenly the connection had space to develop naturally, and a natural connection was precisely what outside influence had been unable to control from the beginning. The third party expected your soulmate to become anxious enough to retreat. Instead, your soulmate became patient enough to stay curious. And patience changed everything. The conversations continued, not constantly, not intensely, but consistently. A message here. A genuine question there. Small moments that rebuilt familiarity without pretending the difficult chapters never existed. Your soulmate discovered new things about who you had become. You discovered that they had changed too. Neither of you was exactly the person the other remembered, and surprisingly, that did not weaken the connection. It made it more interesting. Because now you were not merely trying to recover something old. You were discovering whether something new could grow from what had survived. The third party could sense the difference but could not understand it. Plan number 1 had attempted distance. It failed because seeing each other restored reality. Plan number 2 had attempted interpretation. It failed because direct questions restored context. Plan number 3 attempted timing. And now it was beginning to fail because neither of you believed you needed to solve everything at once. But here is where the story takes another turn. Because your soulmate was about to learn that the 3 plans had not been independent ideas at all. They were connected to one original conversation, a conversation that happened long before you knew there was any third-party involvement. And when your soulmate finally discovered who had started that conversation, what they had actually been trying to protect, and why your name became part of it in the first place, the truth would be far more complicated than simply discovering that someone wanted you apart. Because underneath all 3 plans was a reason nobody had yet understood. And that reason would force your soulmate to reconsider not only the third party, but one decision they themselves had made long before any of this began. What your soulmate discovered next did not arrive as a confession, and that was exactly why it carried so much weight. It came through an ordinary detail buried inside an old conversation. One sentence someone had repeated differently over time, one name attached to a moment your soulmate had almost forgotten, one small inconsistency that suddenly made all three plans look connected. Until then, they had assumed the third party simply reacted to your connection as it developed. They believed the interference came later, after feelings had already become obvious. But the timeline did not fit anymore. The first warning about you had appeared before the distance. The first suggestion that your intentions were uncertain had surfaced before anyone could reasonably know what you intended. And the strange concern about timing, the idea that your soulmate should move on before speaking to you directly, had been planted much earlier than they remembered. Your soulmate sat with that realization quietly because it changed the central question. This was no longer only about why someone wanted distance between you. Now they were wondering why anyone had been paying such close attention to the connection before either of you fully understood what it was. Don't skip this moment, because your soulmate's next discovery did not make them angry. It made them thoughtful. They remembered an evening from long ago when the third party had asked an unusually specific question about you. At the time, it sounded harmless. What do you actually see happening with this person? Your soulmate had laughed it off. They had not yet decided anything. The connection was still developing naturally, without labels or promises. But instead of dropping the subject, the third party had followed with another question. And what happens if they become important to you? That sentence had seemed strange even then. Now it felt completely different. Why ask what would happen if you became important unless somebody had already noticed that you were becoming important? Your soulmate began reconstructing that old conversation from memory. The third party had not criticized you directly. That would have been too obvious. They had spoken instead about practicality, timing, uncertainty, and whether your soulmate should protect their peace. All reasonable ideas on the surface. All gentle enough to sound caring. And perhaps some of that concern had even been genuine. That was the complicated part. Not every influence had necessarily come from cruelty. Sometimes people interfere because they believe they understand a situation better than the people living inside it. Sometimes they see risk where others see possibility. Sometimes their own experiences become a filter through which they interpret somebody else's connection. Your soulmate was beginning to understand that the truth might be more nuanced than simply deciding who was right and who was wrong. Yet one fact remained impossible to ignore. Whatever the original intention had been, too many assumptions had eventually been presented as certainty. Stay a little longer, because this is where your soulmate noticed the clue that changed everything. In the old conversation, the third party had mentioned something about you that you had never told them directly. It was not private or dramatic. It was simply specific enough to raise a question: where had they heard it? Your soulmate remembered thinking nothing of it at the time. Now they asked. The third party hesitated. Someone mentioned it. Your soulmate waited. Who? Another pause. The answer was a person your soulmate barely knew, someone connected loosely to both of your circles, someone who had witnessed one small interaction between you and interpreted far more from it than was actually there. That interaction had become a story. The story had traveled. Each person added a little context of their own. By the time it reached the third party, an ordinary moment had been transformed into evidence about your intentions. And that distorted assumption had become the seed from which plan number one eventually grew. Your soulmate almost smiled at the strange simplicity of it. Months of confusion might have begun because someone misunderstood one conversation. But then another question surfaced. If the first misunderstanding had been accidental, why had the third party continued defending it after contradictory evidence appeared? That was the part your soulmate could not explain. Something important is waiting for you here, because the answer did not come from the third party immediately. It came from something your soulmate remembered about themselves. Long before the distance between you, they had made a decision they never told you about. They had told the third party that they were afraid of getting emotionally invested in anyone again. They had said they wanted to keep things simple. They had admitted that if they started caring deeply, they might pull away rather than risk disappointment. The third party had taken those words seriously, perhaps more seriously than your soulmate did. And when they noticed the connection between you growing, they interpreted your presence through that old promise. In their mind, keeping distance between you was not sabotage. It was helping your soulmate remain consistent with what they had previously said they wanted. Suddenly the original conversation had context. But context did not erase consequences. Your soulmate realized they had unknowingly given someone else permission to reinforce a version of themselves they had already outgrown. That recognition landed deeply. Because perhaps the third party had not invented the fear. Your soulmate had brought the fear into the room themselves. The outside influence simply kept feeding it long after the heart had changed. Your soulmate looked inward before looking outward. That was different from everything that had happened before. Instead of searching for somebody to blame, they asked themselves a harder question: did I ever tell anyone that I had changed my mind? The answer was uncomfortable. Not clearly. They had expected people around them to notice. They had hoped their growing feelings for you would somehow explain themselves. But they had never directly said, "This person matters to me now. Please stop treating this connection like something I need protection from." Without that clarity, the third party continued operating from old information. That did not justify every choice. But it explained why plan number 1 had felt so logical to them. Distance seemed like protection. Plan number 2 had been designed to keep that distance emotionally intact. And plan number 3, the most subtle of all, was supposed to convince your soulmate that revisiting the connection would undo the stability they had once claimed to want. Suddenly all 3 plans had the same root, an outdated version of your soulmate's own wishes. And this is where something remarkable happened. Instead of becoming defensive, your soulmate felt responsible in a healthy way. They could not control what others had done, but they could finally correct the information that had been guiding those actions. So they decided to have one conversation they had been avoiding for far too long. Not with you. With the third party. There would be no confrontation. No dramatic accusation. Your soulmate simply wanted to say what had never been said clearly enough. When the moment came, their voice was calmer than even they expected. "I need you to understand something," they began. The third party immediately sensed that the conversation was different. Your soulmate did not list every misunderstanding. They did not demand explanations for every past event. They began instead with themselves. "A long time ago, I told you I didn't want anything serious. I told you I would probably pull away if I started caring too much." The third party nodded. They remembered. "I meant it then," your soulmate continued. "But I don't mean it now." Silence. That sentence altered the meaning of everything that had followed. The third party tried to explain. They said they had only wanted to prevent your soulmate from repeating old patterns. They said they saw uncertainty and assumed distance would help. They admitted they had worried that your connection with you was becoming stronger faster than your soulmate realized. Some of those words were sincere. Your soulmate could hear it. But sincerity did not mean every action had been wise. You should have let me decide, your soulmate said gently. Not cruelly. Not accusingly. Simply clearly. The third party looked away because there was no easy argument against that. For the first time, the person who had tried to manage the outcome had to face the possibility that their protection had become interference. And here is where the title reaches another level. The third party losing control was never meant to become a story about humiliation. It was about a person realizing they could no longer determine a choice that belonged to somebody else. Your soulmate was reclaiming that choice. Quietly. Maturely. Without needing anyone to lose for them to move forward. The third party finally admitted something your soulmate had not expected. I thought if you got close to them, you would change everything. Your soulmate paused. What do you mean? The answer came slowly. You were finally stable. You were finally predictable. Then you met them, and suddenly you started questioning what you wanted. That sentence followed your soulmate home. Not because it sounded threatening, but because somewhere inside it was an accidental truth. Meeting you had changed what they thought they wanted. Not because you pressured them. Not because you convinced them of anything. Your presence had simply exposed the difference between the life they had planned and the life they might actually desire. That difference had frightened them long before it frightened anyone else. Perhaps the third party had only mirrored back the fear your soulmate was unwilling to admit. The deeper your soulmate thought about it, the more their understanding shifted. They had spent months believing someone else had created the hesitation between you. But the hesitation had begun inside them. The third party amplified it. Circumstances complicated it. Miscommunication stretched it. Yet at the center was a person who cared and became frightened by the fact that caring might require change. That person was your soulmate. And strangely, admitting this brought relief. Because if the entire story had depended only on outside influence, your soulmate would remain powerless. But if some of the distance came from choices they themselves had made, then they could make different choices now. That evening, your soulmate thought about your most recent conversation. Your answer returned to them, one honest step at a time. No deadline. No pressure. No demand to decide the entire future. They suddenly understood why those words had felt so safe. You were not asking them to become someone else overnight. You were giving them room to become honest about who they already were. And maybe that was the thing the third party had misunderstood from the beginning. The connection with you was not necessarily taking peace away from your soulmate. Perhaps it was challenging the kind of peace built on avoidance and replacing it with something deeper, the peace that comes from no longer running from your own truth. The next time your soulmate saw you, they carried this realization differently. You noticed it immediately. There was less uncertainty in the way they looked at you, but there was also more seriousness. They had something to say. Something personal. Yet before revealing it, they asked you a question. Did you ever think I pulled away because I didn't care? The question surprised you. Perhaps you answered carefully. Maybe you admitted there had been moments when you wondered. Maybe you told them that eventually you stopped trying to interpret silence because interpretation had already caused enough confusion between you. Your soulmate nodded slowly. I did care, they said. That was part of the problem. The sentence hung between you. It was not polished. It was not romantic in the obvious way. But it might have been the most vulnerable truth they had offered so far. Caring had made the situation feel larger than they knew how to handle. So they had listened too closely to advice that encouraged retreat. They had accepted explanations that made retreat seem sensible. They had allowed silence to protect them from having to discover what might happen if they actually stayed. And now they were telling you this because they no longer wanted you carrying the belief that their distance meant you had imagined the connection. You listened without interrupting. That mattered more than your soulmate expected. They had prepared themselves for questions, perhaps even disappointment. Instead, you let them finish. I'm not asking you to forget what happened, they continued. I just don't want the old version of me making every decision for the person I am now. Something inside the moment softened. You understood because you had changed too. The person who once waited endlessly for clarity was no longer willing to abandon their own peace for uncertainty. The person your soulmate remembered was still part of you, but not all of you. If something new was going to happen between you, it could not be built only from nostalgia. It needed honesty, reciprocity, and room for both people to choose freely. You told them this. And instead of being discouraged, your soulmate seemed almost relieved. They did not want to recreate the old connection exactly as it had been. They wanted the possibility of building something clearer. That was when they told you about the conversation with the third party. Not every detail. Not as gossip. Simply enough for you to understand what had been happening underneath the surface. You did not react the way they feared. You did not demand that they cut anyone out of their life. You did not ask them to choose sides. You only said something they would remember later: people can care about us and still misunderstand what is right for us. Your soulmate became quiet because that sentence gave them permission to hold two truths at once. The third party might have cared. The third party might also have crossed boundaries. Understanding one did not require denying the other. And forgiveness, if it came, did not require returning control. From that moment onward, your soulmate began changing how they handled advice about you. They listened, but they stopped outsourcing decisions. They considered other perspectives, but they checked them against their own experience. They stopped treating uncertainty as proof that something was wrong. Sometimes uncertainty simply meant something meaningful had not been fully understood yet. And the third party noticed this new independence almost immediately. Their opinions were no longer followed automatically. Your soulmate no longer explained every conversation with you. They no longer asked for permission to feel curious. That was perhaps the hardest part for the third party, not losing your soulmate, but losing the role of interpreter between the two of you. Yet even that change eventually created an unexpected possibility. Without the pressure of managing your soulmate's connection, the third party had room to examine their own behavior. They began wondering whether they had been protecting your soulmate or protecting the version of the relationship between them that felt familiar. Because if your soulmate became closer to you, their priorities might shift. Their routines might change. Their emotional dependence on other people might lessen. The third party had feared losing something too. Not necessarily your soulmate entirely, but their place in your soulmate's life. That fear had quietly influenced choices they had convinced themselves were purely protective. The realization humbled them. And for the first time, the third party stopped planning. No fourth strategy appeared. No new interpretation was prepared. There was only uncertainty, and perhaps the beginning of acceptance. But your story with your soulmate was not finished simply because outside interference had weakened. In some ways, the real work was only beginning now. Because once nobody else was standing between you, you both had to answer the question that had been avoided through every plan, every misunderstanding, and every delay. What did you actually want from each other now? Your soulmate could no longer hide behind someone else's warnings. You could no longer blame every hesitation on outside influence. The path was clearer, which meant the choice was finally real. One evening, after another conversation that began casually and somehow reached deeper territory, your soulmate looked at you and said, "I've spent so much time trying to understand what happened between us that I haven't asked what you want now." The question changed the energy instantly. You had imagined hearing something like this many times, yet the real moment felt quieter than the imagined one. There was no dramatic music inside your mind. No perfect answer waiting. Just truth. You told them you wanted something honest. Something that did not need games or hidden tests. Something where both of you could speak before assumptions hardened into distance. You did not demand a label. You did not ask for promises neither of you could guarantee. You said you wanted to discover what was possible without repeating what had already failed. Your soulmate listened closely. Then they gave an answer that surprised you. "That scares me a little." You smiled, perhaps because it was the most believable response they could have given. Why? They took a moment before answering. "Because if we do this honestly, I can't pretend I don't care if it matters." There it was. The truth beneath the entire story. Not the third party. Not the three plans. Not the warnings. Not even the misunderstanding. Beneath everything was the simple vulnerability of caring about something you could not fully control. Your soulmate had been trying to avoid that vulnerability from the very beginning. And now, instead of running from it, they were naming it in front of you. That did not guarantee an outcome. But it changed the foundation. You told them courage did not mean knowing exactly what would happen. Sometimes courage meant being honest even while the future remained unwritten. Your soulmate looked at you with an expression you had not seen in a long time. Not certainty. Something perhaps more valuable, willingness. The willingness to find out. And that should have been the quiet resolution of everything, except one final piece remained hidden. Because the third party had told your soulmate nearly everything about why the three plans began, but they had not explained why plan number 2 had used that specific moment from your past. Someone else had chosen it. Someone who knew more about the original misunderstanding than either you or your soulmate realized. And 3 days after your soulmate decided to stop allowing other people to define the connection, a message appeared from that person with only one unexpected sentence. "There's something you both need to know about what really happened that day."